it doesn't have to be that it was on a person or a person neglected us or whatever. It can be medical trauma, a parent passed away young, there can be all kinds of things that disrupt how you feel safe in the world.
Hello and welcome to the Wellness Dojo podcast, where we bring real solutions to real health and wellness problems. Today, I'm excited to have Katrina Shaw, registered psychologist, with us. We talk about trauma, how to recognize trauma in your life, and start to heal that trauma so that you can go on to live a better life. I hope you enjoy this episode. Let's get into it. All right, welcome back to the Wellness Dojo podcast. I'm your host, Craik, and I'm very excited to have Katrina Shaw here, registered psychologist, to join us on the show to talk about some really important topics as always. So Katrina, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm excited.
I'm excited too. I know we've been trying to do this for a while. I know you're super busy. You've got a lot going on. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got into the practice and how you got to where you are now and all the different things that you have going on?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's probably a more long-winded story behind all this, but I'll keep it brief. For as long as I can remember, I was interested in psychology. That was kind of my plan. I guess it sort of pivoted and evolved over the years from I was going to be a teacher and be a school counselor, and then it just sort of evolved and changed as I grew and changed. I'd say that where I've landed today, where I do a lot of trauma work and a lot of processing sort of somatically and in the body. I have some other modalities of healing that I use as well. Like I'm trained in somatic breath work and energy work and yoga and meditation. So kind of another sort of branch of wellness and healing. And how I got there is, I think, just my own journey of healing. I had lost my dad young, lost a friend to suicide a few months later. And I think that just catapulted me into a life of having to reevaluate what really matters to me and what is important. And then I had to explore healing. Like I really had to dive into like, what does healing mean? How do we heal? And it became a very like profound process for me, much deeper than what I maybe initially had understood the field to be, or maybe even some of my perspectives on what healing is. So that's kind of how I got to where I am today and how I practice the way I do. And then, then I have just other projects and things going on in addition to my practice. So some of you may know that we just opened a new clinic with Men's League, and so we're really focusing on targeting the niche of supporting men, and that comes predominantly from I have a belief that as much as men have been in the positions of privilege, and men have been in the positions of being oppressors, and the women's movement has been really powerful in trying to get us to like have a voice and to have spaces in business and all of those pieces. I guess I see a problem if we are dismissive to men. Like I see a problem if women are trying to evolve past and be like, we don't really care about men. They've been in positions of privilege. Because when I look at the statistics, men are at greater risk for domestic violence, to be perpetrators. Men are at greater risk of ending their lives by suicide. There's all these issues, and I want to be part of the solution. I don't want to continue to like perpetuate the problem. I don't want to sit back and be like, well, women are going to rise, and I don't really care what happens to men. So I'm sitting here from the perspective of like, I really want to bring men and women together. I really want men to heal. I really want men to feel like they have spaces to heal. And I I want us to work together. I want people and humans to come back together and to really support one another. And as a, you know, woman who has a brother and a dad, well, a dad that passed away, and you know, hopefully a father of my kids one day, and all of these pieces, I want men to evolve with us, and I want them to heal with us.
Yeah, I think
So
that's you hit on something that's so important, right? Is like, in order for everybody to evolve and everybody to grow and be better, like we all have to have this focus on healing, right? If
mhm.
men don't focus on healing as well, how are we ever going to be better for the women as we try to, you know, empower more women and do those things? Like we have to understand ourselves and understand our own, as you said, like traumas and healing, and how, like, you know, why have things been the way that they've been, and those types of things, right?
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
you mentioned trauma, and that's something that I'm very, very interested in. How does trauma typically come into play in terms of healing, or when you're working with your clients? Like, is that often a big thing that comes up with your clients?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're only really starting to understand trauma um, in like the field in research and in the field of psychology in recent years, right? Like, I mean, in the last decade, probably it hasn't really been. I mean, even look back at our parents' generation, right? They didn't talk about these kinds of things. They weren't dealing with you know, what happened in their past or their parents' past, those kinds of things. So it's relatively new, but it's trauma can happen everywhere, and it's more common than you think. So I guess the important difference here is that stress is very common. We live in a society that, you know, expects you to be a certain way and has a lot of pressures and financial and you know, endless stresses. And so stress is something where, you know, you can experience the physical manifestations of stress, but then once you're through the event, it tends to like resolve and not really affect you. The difference with trauma is that trauma has an impact on the body, and trauma affects the brain. And trauma has a lasting impact. So when you think about trauma, it doesn't have to be, lots of people are like, they come to me and they don't really realize that they've had some sort of like childhood trauma, um, because they're like, well, I had a pretty good childhood. You know, parents were loving. But what they didn't realize is that potentially they grew up in like a situation of poverty. Both parents had to work, weren't really present or available. They spent a lot of time alone. And then you start to look at that, like that experience for a kid is going to have an effect on you if you've spent most of your life alone or most of your childhood alone. And so trauma has a lasting impact, and that is more common than you think. Um, so we can get a little more into like what is the impact on the body and things, but I'll kind of leave it there to see if you have any like questions or
Yeah, of course.
clarifications.
No, absolutely. And I think what's really interesting to me is the word trauma, just in
Mm-hmm.
itself. I think oftentimes when people think of the word trauma, they think of like, no, I've never been through anything like super traumatic. Like, no, I've never, you
Mm-hmm.
know, never been raped or never, you know, abused drugs or had drugs put on me, like those types of things. But like what you're saying, it sounds like trauma comes in many different shapes and sizes, and oftentimes it can be almost unrecognizable because we think like, no, I've been pretty privileged in my life. Like I don't have anything to complain about. I shouldn't complain about my
Mm-hmm.
life. But people do have trauma that they're living with that they maybe don't realize that they're living with.
Totally. And this is kind of like a problem of our society is it's like we're very like emotion phobic in the sense that like
Mm,
we're just like you should be good, you know? And so we hear this like rationalization from people all the time of like, oh, things like weren't that bad, and like, you know, I had a decent childhood, and we sort of dismiss experiences. We dismiss how things have affected us. And you know, I'm really passionate about helping people move to like, it's okay to say something affected you. Like, this is how we begin to heal. Like, it's okay to say, maybe my parents had great intentions, but they weren't great in meeting my needs. They weren't great in like helping me to feel safe and secure. And that is like a really hard step to get to a place where we feel okay to acknowledge maybe it wasn't so great, even if on the surface it looks like it was.
Yeah, I think that's a hard thing for a lot of people to like, they feel like they're pointing the finger at their parents, like, oh, I'm just blaming my parents for my problems now. But it's like,
Yeah.
well, but yeah, like in a way it kind of is, everything is, I'm a parent. It's like I look at everything, I'm like, everything is my fault. Like every step that I take with my kids, it is my fault. And you have to get to a place of, like you mentioned, acceptance almost of, I'm gonna screw some things up, but I'm doing my best and I'm gonna give them the tools that they need to deal with that and to heal the different things that do come up in their life inevitably, right?
Totally. And this is where like, so I think fundamentally when we're talking about trauma, we want to talk about like safety.
Mm,
And I'm not talking about safety in terms of like, you're only like you're physically safe from harm. Safety is emotional safety as well. And emotional safety has a huge impact on how life events affect a kid in particular at early developmental stages. And so I'll give like kind of a brief rundown just so that listeners have an idea. But essentially, if you think about an infant, they have to rely on a parent to keep them alive. Like their survival is dependent on another person because like they can't feed themselves, they can't walk, they can't, get their own water, they can't do all the things that human beings need for survival. So in early life, safety and survival is dependent on another human being. So we're very relationally wired. Like we are, this is where we sort of can get into, I mean, you can go down a whole branch of like attachment theory and all of that, which might be potentially another episode, but for the sake of what we're talking about, if an infant or a young child perceives like I'm not emotionally safe, let's say like a kid is overwhelmed and crying at a grocery store and the parent is like yelling at them like, be quiet, we're in public, like blah, blah, blah. Like you see that a lot. The parent starts to get frustrated and overwhelmed and they're telling the kid to like be quiet. That isn't helping a kid to feel like, hey, I got you. Like, what's going on? What's happening in your little body that you're feeling like not okay? And so this is where we can see that, like, even if a parent really means well and their own overwhelm and their own whatever's like causing them to get like frustrated or worked up, and then it sort of passes on to the kid, then there's going to be an effect on how the kid perceives like, are emotions okay? Are they going to learn that they can express themselves? Are they going to feel emotionally like seen and heard and valued? Like there's a whole like lot of things that unfold. And so when I'm talking to parents, I'm like, it's okay that your kid gets dysregulated. It's okay that like, you get a little frustrated at times. The parts that we really want to work on as parents is like, how do you work on your own regulation, your own emotional stuff so that you can help them work through that. And the rest of it like doesn't really matter. If you're a safe, reliable person, it doesn't matter if they get mad at you, doesn't matter if they like get hurt, doesn't matter if things aren't totally great in life. It's that like if you can be that anchor point and
mm,
you work on your own stuff, then your kid is going to be okay.
yeah. I, that's such a great example too of how like trauma can be passed down in like a very, very practical, in your face sense of, that parent who's, getting so frustrated at the grocery store likely comes from a place of when they were a kid and they were having an emotional breakdown and their parent was also like, embarrassed or overwhelmed or like, you can't do that here, like not in front of my coworkers or whatever the case might be. That behavior almost gets passed down, right, through insecurity or whatever had caused them to become overwhelmed in that moment.
Mm-hmm. and
Yeah.
it's and it just, this is where like it shows us we all have our own work to do, and this is like one small example, right?
Mm-hmm.
It but we all have our own work to do. And so rather than like shaming or blaming yourself of, I've been a terrible parent, or I haven't, met my child's needs, I think this is where we all have a responsibility to be like, how can I like manage my own stuff better? How can I like, what do I need to work through and heal so that this doesn't happen the same way, in the grocery store or whatever the trigger is. But it's, this is where I really try to normalize, like, you, me, and every other person we all have our like breaking point. We all have a trigger. We all have something. We can either sort of be on the side where it's like, I'm not going to work on this. This doesn't matter. Or we can be on the really compassionate side of like, I am doing my best and I'm continuing to try to like be better and heal so that I can show up in a different way. And that's where I try to move most of my clients, is like, no one is going to be perfect. It's just, are we like committed to trying to like heal those parts and be better? And then that's how we move through things.
Yeah, it sounds like the old cliche of you got to put your own mask on first so you can take care of everybody else, right? And it's like it's almost beaten to death, this cliche or this phrase, but it pops up in so many different aspects of wellness and mental wellness, physical wellness, of like, if you don't focus on yourself first, like how are you possibly expecting yourself to be better for your kids? If you're not taking care of your own physical health, how do you expect your kids to grow up and do that? If you're not taking care of your own trauma inside, how do you expect your kids to be able to deal with their own trauma? How do you expect to give them those tools, right?
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned just a little while back about how you kind of recognize trauma and separate that from just like regular daily stress. You said you feel trauma a little bit more in the body. Can you describe a little bit more how people can recognize, like, is this like a traumatic event that I'm dealing with right now, or is this just daily stress?
Yeah. So with trauma and how it sort of like has lasting effect, and essentially what it does is like disrupt safety in the body. So when we think about it from a body and brain perspective, is that you're going to typically see it in like either, very common symptoms are going to be like sort of like depression or mood issues or anxiety issues, and people can't really like explain it. Like they're like, I'm just always anxious, and because the thing is that essentially what's happening in your body is that you had whatever trauma experience, it overwhelms the nervous system, and it basically changes the brain to feel like I'm not safe. And so it needs to be hyper vigilant. And so the brain and body remember like, we're not safe, we're not safe. And it's essentially like, imagine like a fire alarm going off all the time, like, and we don't know how to turn it off. There's no fire in the building, there's no actual event happening, but the fire alarm is just going off, going off, going off. And so typically you'll see this it'll commonly show up in like anxiety and depression, or it can start to show up in ways where we're like really shut down. So what can happen is that like the brain is brilliant in how it will protect you. And so if something has been like just too much over time, like it just, again, like it could have been, it doesn't have to be like something extreme. It can just be that it was like prolonged over time. And what can happen is that it was just like too overwhelming for the body. So then you might develop a pattern of like the brain just kind of shuts off. Like you kind of just turn off from emotion. So you might see it too with people that are like really disconnected from emotion and really like sort of shut down, or like have a hard time like dealing with difficult conversations, those kinds of things. Now I kind of want to give a caveat, because I'm not saying that everyone who has depression or anxiety or like avoids emotion has like, I'm not saying, okay, yeah, you have some like unresolved trauma, like, you got to go, back digging into your past and figure it out. Like I'm more so talking about like, how do we see this? But even if you have some of those challenges, I think it's just about trying to understand, where does this come from for you? and what is happening in your own body, right? So these would be like typical sort of symptoms, but it doesn't necessarily mean you have like some buried trauma that you just never addressed.
Yeah.
um yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I mean, it sounds like there's different people have various different levels of trauma as well, right? Where, and then some of it's going to be more, I guess kind of where my mind is going is like the difference now in trauma between trauma that's been passed down to you and trauma that is, I guess, like yours, where again, like something happens like a car accident that you were involved in. Somebody can develop a real fear to driving, or like it changes their behavior in that sense. Whereas trauma that's been passed down, it sounds like that might be something more where you're like, I don't understand why I am the way that I am. And then it's like, okay, let's start to go back into my past and see what events maybe could have caused me to be this way. Like why do I have this dependency issue, or why do I have
Mhm.
trouble getting involved in relationships and commitment, and or anything like that? Is that kind of, am I catching on there?
Yeah,
Yeah.
you're definitely catching on. There's one caveat that I'll sort of add in there, is that even like an incidental trauma or trauma that's happened to you in this life, that, and I'll explain generational trauma in a second,
Yeah.
but even trauma that's happened to you in this life, you may not have um you may not have like explicit memory of it, right? So it could be that, like, I don't know, a dog jumped at you and bit you when you were 3, and you don't remember that incident. Like your brain might have blocked it out and you don't remember that. And you have like a terrible fear of dogs now, but you have no actual explicit memory of what happened. Um, so trauma can still affect the body pre memory and pre verbal, like in your early ages. And this is where like the world of trauma is really, really, really fascinating. Is because the body remembers whether you have like explicit memory of it or not, or whether you had language at that time or not. And so part of um, part of healing is like, again, it kind of just depends on how deep you want to go, right? Like for myself, I'm fascinated by this. So like I have wanted to kind of go back as deep as I can and understand more about myself, understand more about my body. So like I'm really, really attentive to my own nervous system. Like what are the things that set me off? What are the things that like, and the world might not even see it. Like I'm not typically a very anxious person. I present pretty confident and good, and people are like, oh, you have your life together. But the truth is that that's that's just what the world sees. I become very like high functioning in hiding whatever I'm going through. But I actually experience quite a lot, and I'm like very sensitive. I pick up on energy, I pick up on emotion, like, and so part of my journey has been like, I really want to understand what's going on for me. I really want to understand how to like fully support my own nervous system, my own body, listen to that, so that I'm not in situations where I'm like perpetuating, I don't know, letting people like treat me poorly, or whatever it is, right? I mean, if it's helpful, I can like give an example, but I just want to be able to like honor my body, honor my boundaries, know what's gone on for me, so that I can continue to live a like healthier and happier life. And that isn't all just like explicit memory.
Yeah. I agree. It's so fast. I was actually just explaining to my son just the other day about how like the brain can lock memories away. I'm like, you can have memories that you don't even know are there. And he was like, what? I was like, yeah, like your brain just like stores so much stuff, and then like later on in life, something might happen and you'll go like, oh, I just remembered this time, or like now I don't know if this is a real memory or if this was a dream, or like the brain is so fascinating, right? And is that a defense mechanism by the brain to kind of lock something away and go like, oh, we don't need this memory right now because it's dangerous?
Yeah, it can be like, this is where we can sort of we don't the brain can sort of block it out and we just don't really have memory of it. But it could also be that like it just happened at a developmental age that you just don't have explicit memory. Like a perfect example is, in one area that I've been fascinated to explore is like birth trauma and like early life trauma. And the reason for that is that like I have an identical twin. We were 2 months premature, and we were put in an incubator and spent the first 2 months of our life in an incubator. And like historically, we would have been like, okay, la di da, you're a healthy person, you're good, all this stuff. But when you actually look at that from like an attachment perspective and a safety perspective, I mean, that isn't ideal for a little baby's nervous system. Like typically a baby wants to breastfeed, have skin to skin contact, be soothed by a parent, all of the things that its nervous system needs to like feel safe. Whereas like I was in a box separated from my twin, needles and tubes being shoved into me, people grabbing me, not held, no skin to skin contact. So like when you look at this now from the field of research, that has an impact on your body, whether you think it does or you think it doesn't. And that's fascinating to me, because it wasn't that my mom did anything wrong, but that still had an impact. And so that's an example of where I've like gone back. I've done a lot of like modalities of healing to understand like what impact did that have as a baby for me to, basically like be in a box for 2 months and have people like grab me out of my body and shoving tubes down my throat, right? So there's all kinds of ways that like trauma can affect us. And it doesn't have to be that it was on a person or a person neglected us or whatever. It can be medical trauma, a parent passed away young, there can be all kinds of things that disrupt how you feel safe in the world.
Yeah, it's like it really does make people think about, what has happened to me that I don't even know has happened to me. I do want to talk a little bit about generational trauma and like how that looks, how that actually gets passed down. But I also am very interested in just like how people can start to heal that, because not everybody is in that mindset of like, oh, I really do. I'm very curious about self-exploration and understanding myself more, but they're still living with this trauma. Maybe first, can we talk about the generational trauma and how that looks, and maybe even how people can recognize that, and then get into how we start to heal it?
Yeah. So generational trauma, also relatively new understanding. A lot of the research is around like kids of Holocaust survivors. So what researchers realized is that a lot of people who had parents that were Holocaust survivors, the kids had a lot of sort of like anxiety or mood disturbances. This is what sort of like, this is where the field of research sort of prompted deeper inquiry into this area. And it's still very complex in understanding sort of the science behind how is this actually passed on. From an energetic perspective, we know that like that everything is energy, and that energy affects energy. And so we can see it in the sense that like a parent's disturbance is going to affect a kid's disturbance in a very like behavioral way. But when we look at it from how generational trauma is being passed on, I mean, there's so many aspects that are passed on. There's like, we get genetics passed on from parents, we get, personality traits passed on from parents, we all kinds of things that are passed down. There isn't like one exact, like, this is exactly how trauma is passed from generation to generation. However, if you think about, this might be a little like out far reach for some people, but I did one training where they talked about how, like, when your grandma has your mom already has the eggs in her body that is going to eventually like birth you. So when you look at like the cells are already there, like the energy, and body and your cells are affected by trauma, whether you think it does or not. So it can affect, like, if you feel like there's just like, when I start to explore this with my clients, if you feel like there's just like unexplained reasons of why you have something, like if you're like, oh yeah, like this makes sense in the context of my life of why I have this disturbance, we can kind of start there. But if you're like, I just don't get it, like I don't have understanding of like where this comes from, why it's here, what's happening to me, you start to like look further and further back. You're like, what did your parents go through? Were they survivors of war? Did they have disturbances in their life? Did they have healthy parents? Like, you start to like look further and further back and see, is there a thread that kind of comes through, and start to make sense of it. So sometimes people have to, go back, talk to their parents, talk to their grandparents, trying to make sense of their story, to help understand potentially what is the impact here. And there's a really good book that is called It Didn't Start With You. And this is like a book that's very, you can just read the book if you want, but it also has like prompts of like journaling exercises to like journal, what is my core belief, and what am I most afraid of, and how do I like continue sort of like get at what is the root of what's going on. So the book is also really good as a starting point of how do I start to work through what's happening. You might want to consider having a therapist that you work with so that you can have some support as you go through that. But the book is really, really fascinating because it's like, this didn't start here with you. It started somewhere back, and explains it in a really great way and helps you to begin to like peel back the layers.
Is it possible for people to, let's say, like my great grandfather had this trauma that he dealt with, maybe like in the war or something like that? Is it possible that even if I hadn't like heard the story about this or had no knowledge of this, that I can still be triggered from that trauma from like 3 generations back?
Yeah, so the book It Didn't Start With You talks a lot about this, where you don't have to necessarily know anything, right? And so this, Mark Wolyn is his name, and his work clinically with people is that, like, someone, he uses the language that people use a lot to like uncover what's happening. So like he tells stories and tells accounts of like, yes, someone believes that they're gonna like, they keep using language like, I'm just gonna disappear, I'm gonna just evaporate, and he's like using that, he's like trying to peel back the language, like it's an interesting statement that you're making about yourself, like what happened in your history. And then usually it relates directly back to, a few generations back of like someone was, I don't know, burned in the Holocaust or whatever happened in their family, and that energy was just sort of transferred to them. Again, do we have like a very clear understanding of why or how that happens? No. But then, and they wouldn't have even, some of these accounts, they don't even know the story, but it was like had a grip on them, and their language is usually the thing that like led him to like, what, this is interesting language, this isn't language of like, a typical problem in our normal life of like, I'm gonna evaporate or I'm gonna whatever, right? So yeah, absolutely, it can affect you. And so you're going a little bit on like a deep dive or a journey to understand like what is happening here, like what has something gone on in my storyline that I'm carrying with me that's not even mine.
Yeah. And I imagine that would be so much more difficult for somebody who maybe is disconnected from their family, right? Where if somebody who's dealing with trauma, but they don't have a strong connection with their family, or they, never knew their grandparents, or maybe they never even knew their parents, that I would imagine becomes then very difficult to then start to like understand and search back into like, okay, where does this come from? Why am I the way that I am too, right?
For sure. This isn't like, just this isn't an easy process. And I'm a big believer that like we can't, we're very heady in our society. Like we're very like intellectual. We want everything to be like X plus Y equals Z kind
Yeah.
of thing.
Everything has to
And
make
oh, this
sense.
is everything has to make sense, and everything has to be in a box, and everything has to be linear. And I always talk to my clients like, this isn't linear. This is not a linear process.
Mm-hmm.
And what is often taken from us in these experiences of trauma, or just even in our socialization in today, and particularly men who are like told you can't feel anything and don't show emotion and all of that, is that we have lost the ability to like trust ourselves. We have lost the ability to just listen and to like connect and be like, okay, there's a bit of an intuitive like process here to healing. And what I mean by that is that like if the brain can imagine something and experience something, and something comes up, it doesn't matter if it's like, well, was that the exact thing, and did that actually happen, and was that the exact account of it, or is that something that you're feeling? Like, are you feeling like that has significance for you? And if you do, and if there is something that feels like it has a hold on you, then we work with that. It doesn't, the head doesn't need to be like, oh, this was the exact thing that happened. And so the starting points of trauma work is often like reconnecting to a sense of safety in the body, reconnecting to like, and that can look like, am I able to just even do like a body scan? Am I comfortable connecting to like, what am I feeling, and where am I feeling it in my body? And how do I know it's, anger and not sadness? And like, it's, I mean, these are the like foundational pieces of coming back to ourselves and coming back to the body and being like, am I listening to what's happening? Because your head will never figure it out. Like this isn't a process that happens intellectually. This is not a process that happens in the head.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great, because my next question was going to be just how important is actually nailing down that trauma and being like, oh, this is where it comes from. Like, and it sounds like what you're saying is similar to what I preach a lot when I'm working with clients with wellness coaching and stuff too, is like, whatever habits your parents gave you or whatever habits you've developed along the way, it's about what do I do right now? How do I start to correct those now? What actions do I take right now? And it sounds, if I'm hearing you correctly, it sounds like that's what you're saying as well. It's like, it's good to explore these things and try to understand where it came from, but at the end of the day, it's about like how I feel now and how do I start to heal that now so that it doesn't move forwards.
Yeah. And so sometimes even just acknowledging, even just honoring our body can like release the hold the trauma has on us. So this is where again, like it's not like this is like a doing process, like, oh, I have to like go do this thing and heal
It'll
this
fix it.
part
Yeah.
and it fix it. It's sometimes even just the acknowledgement and honoring of like, oh, whoa, like my needs didn't actually get met as a kid, even though I thought maybe they did, or I didn't even ever consider that that was a thing. Sometimes that can be enough to be like, okay, like now I really want to learn going forward, how do I get my needs met in a healthy way? So sometimes it's just the acknowledgement of what's happened to us that helps set us free and move us forward. If we continue in this sort of like dismissal of emotion and dismissal of our bodies and all those pieces, you can go into like skills moving forward. Like you can go into like, okay, how do I like, let me give you an example. Like often people will come in and they like want to set a goal of, I don't know, whether it's, financial goal or, physical goal or whatever. So we can go into the like step from here and move forward and like work on this. But if you continue to meet like resistance, or you continue to meet hurdles, or you continue to like not be successful, sometimes I'm like, okay, well then we have to understand, like, is there something underneath that? Or is there a root to, maybe you don't feel worthy enough of this? Maybe there's a part of you that doesn't believe you're deserving. Maybe there's a part of you that has a lot of fear of what success means, or whatever it might be. So like, I'm always looking at, we can go the step just from today forward, or we can also have like a greater understanding of like, what are the things that have affected you? And again, we don't have to go back and like dig up everything from your past. We just have to understand, is there a hold? Is there something gripping you and holding you back? And then we address that piece. And so I'm always working sort of on the like, yeah, let's move forward. But our past definitely affects how we are, who we are today, and how we move forward.
How difficult is that typically for people? Like when you're working with them, are they typically surprised that it's like easier to kind of pinpoint some of these things, and or do you find people have to work really hard to kind of go back and be like, oh, actually, I do now realize like my mom did this, or this is a behavior that my parents had that, maybe impacted me, or is everybody just different? Everybody's
Yeah, I think everybody's just very different because there's a lot of elements to, again, it's like, what was your relationship to emotion even growing up? How did you learn to express yourself? Are you tuned into your body? Are you naturally self-reflective? Like, do you reflect on your own behavior? Are you like, there's so many aspects that help and support that process. And if you're kind of like, I don't self-reflect, I'm very disconnected from my emotions, um and like I mean, then we have some more like fundamental pieces to like build a relationship with yourself. And that, that's a process that doesn't happen in one session, because you typically, if you're coming to me as an adult, you've lived your whole life with this pattern. And so it's sometimes it's just about trusting the process and knowing that like you are moving through stuff every time that you're like engaged in the process of therapy or whatever mode of healing, meditation, any of those things. You are moving through stuff, but it is a process. So yeah, it's kind of different for everybody.
Yeah, and I imagine in your field you see a range of people. Some people coming in who are like, "Hey, I'm really excited to get to the bottom of this. I'm really excited to explore my emotions." And then you do have those people who come in that are like very much guarded. They're like, "I'm only here because because my spouse told me I should come," or like those types of things. For a person like that who's very guarded, what do you recommend as like a first step to even maybe bring themselves to try and go and seek like therapy, or to go and try some modality to start that healing? Like how does somebody get over that initial hurdle?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I'm a big believer in not, I can't pull anyone anywhere. Like I
Yeah.
can't get anyone to go anywhere that they don't want to go. So I really try to honor each person in terms of like, if you're not ready, that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
And at some point you might get there, and at some point and you may not, you also may not in this lifetime decide that you want to go back and work on stuff. So I I don't know that you can pull someone along. I think people have to decide for themselves, like, yeah, this is really hard, but I want to do it. And if they're sitting in front of me, like if they actually get into my office and they've made that first step, I mean, I work very, very, very relationally. So I have no intention of somebody coming in and being like, okay, this is what you need, and here's where we're going, and this is how, like, I work to like really connect with them, have them feel safe, because if they feel safe enough to come, that's a big deal. And if they continue to feel safe to come, that's a big deal. And so I really try to meet people where they're at, and um and then we work from there. Like slowly they'll get more comfortable, and I'm like, okay, like I ask for permission, like, are we okay to go here, are we okay to like explore this? And if they're like, I'm just not there, I'm like, okay, like let's start somewhere that does feel okay. And
Yeah.
so yeah, like my model of working is not to push or force anyone into anything that they're not comfortable with, because then I'm just perpetuating trauma. Like you don't feel safe and I'm trying to force you somewhere, like that doesn't work. So I think for anything, it's like establishing a sense of safety. Like, hey, I'm here. I got you, but we'll take this one step at a time based on where you're at.
Yeah, I think that's a really important aspect of just like seeking help is I think a lot of people go into it, especially people who are a little bit more emotionally guarded, may go into it thinking like, oh, I'm gonna go and they're gonna tell me like that I have to do this or I have to do that, and it's gonna be very uncomfortable for me. Whereas 90% of the time, I think when you do go and you seek help, especially if you're finding somebody like yourself who's good at what they do and who's experienced, they're going to be a passenger on your journey and just kind of help correct you along the way in a sense. That's probably not the right way to say that, but yeah, just kind of correct you along the way and guide you like, oh, maybe we go this route, is that okay? Do you want to go this route? Maybe we go this route today instead. Like, you're very much meeting them where they're at, it sounds like.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. That's like my fundamental principle. I see everyone as like as just a human being. We all have a story. It is not my job to come in here and act like, I don't know, the expert of your life. You are the expert of your life, and I'm gonna respect that. And I'm just gonna be there in it with you. And obviously, if you want my guidance and you want my wisdom, and if that's what you want, I'll share it. If you just want somebody to be there, I'll be that, right? Like, I think I really try to understand what do people want out of me and out of therapy. And yeah, like then, the more that I build safety with people, the more that I have a relationship with them, more there is trust, then I can like challenge them at times and be like, okay, hey, like, I'm feeling like this might be significant. And then even then people are like, yeah, let's do it. Or they're like, okay, I'm not ready yet, like, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome. A ton of really great information that we've covered. It sounds to me like a big takeaway for me from this conversation is in terms of trauma and beginning to heal trauma, a really big first step is just like recognition and like really trying to recognize how you feel, like what is that feeling, and then starting to explore kind of where that feeling might be coming from.
Yeah, and I'd say that if you can like take away the sort of fundamental principle of safety,
Hmm.
um, so the more that we can like understand the nervous system and like, that's our fight, flight, or freeze response, the more that we can understand that that system is designed to like keep us safe. So we want to honor it. We also want to understand, is there something that's like an alarm bell going off that doesn't need to be going off anymore? And how do we turn that off? So I think that that's the piece, is like, if you want to feel better in this life, coming to understand, how do I feel safe in my body? How do I feel secure? Those are important fundamental pieces. And how do I like regulate my body to feel like I can like come down and relax, and like that might be the starting point, might be that like in your bedroom is the safe place, and you really anchor yourself there, and that's how you feel connected to your body in that one space, right? Like it can be very this doesn't have to be a global like, yeah, I feel safe in the world today. It's just starting somewhere of like, where and how do I feel safe?
Yeah. Awesome. Um, where can people find you? Where can people get your information, website, social media?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my website is Katrinashaw.ca. Pretty simple, my name. And then my Instagram handle is YYC psychologist. So you can all follow there. And yeah.
That's awesome. Definitely go and check Katrina out. Thank you for doing this. Is there anything that was left unsaid or that you wanted to get out that you hadn't had the opportunity to yet?
No, I don't think so. I think just for any listeners that maybe want, I had mentioned the book It Didn't Start With You. So that book is by Mark Wolyn. If anyone's interested, you can look that up. It's a really great resource.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll maybe put that resource in the show notes as well as your website and your Instagram handle. And yeah, thanks again for doing this. This was fun.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Of course. All right. And thank you for listening or watching, and we'll see you guys in the next episode. For additional support or to work with one of us one-on-one, go to our website, www.wellnessdojo.ca. You can also find us on Instagram at Wellness Dojo YYC or on all other social media platforms searching The Wellness Dojo. We'll see you in the next episode.